Hello, friends. Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times. As peace negotiations unfold between the Trump administration and Ukraine and Russia, Europe and the whole world are watching. As always, we hope to bring more light than heat to these policy discussions as we bring guests to you from across the policy spectrum. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Peter Pomerantsev, who works as a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative. Between 2017 and 20, he was a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he is the director of the initiative research project, which was dedicated to overcoming the challenges of the digital era disinformation and polarization that we see so much in our world today. His book on Russian propaganda, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Donatich Prize and was nominated for the Samuel Johnson Guardian First Book, Pushkin House, and Gordon Burns Prizes. It's been translated into over a dozen languages and was even dramatized on BBC4 radio. Peter has testified about the challenges of the information war and media development to the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the U.K. Parliament Defence Select Committee. Welcome, Peter. It's an honor to have you.
I am very honored to be here. Thank you.
Yes, I always love to have friends from across the pond, and I think we should first start our conversation with just, not burying the lead. We see in the news that Ukraine's going to be sending a new delegation to Washington to really discuss a fine-tuned mineral rights deal. This is the elusive deal that blew up in the Oval Office during the meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance. Do you believe that this joint investment fund has a chance to be signed and really become a bridge towards partnership between Zelensky and Trump and Ukraine and the U.S.?
So listen, this was initially an idea of Ukraine's. This isn't something that was initially foisted upon by DC. This was very much Ukraine saying, look, let's move to a different kind of relationship where we're partners. Let's move beyond just kind of rhetoric around values and help, and let's be more concrete. So this is something that came from the Ukrainians. So definitely it can be done. Look, the sticking points, I think, is this about the future, or Trump sometimes confusingly says this is a payment for the past, which is just basically weird, let's be honest, because the military aid and support from the past, that had a contracts and paperwork attached to it. So I think the Ukrainians are deeply confused about that part. And then there's the terms of sort of sharing it. I mean, are they fair? Are they exploitative? But, that's something I think that can be worked out. But I think that, this idea about, is this about the future or about the past is an important element. But in a sense, all of this is moot and really just a piece of paper if we can't have clarity about what happens in the short and medium term, because this is a long-term ambition. It's a statement of intent and partnership. But the real issue is, can Ukraine be secure enough to make any kind of economic development happen? Because you need security and peace and stability for that. And what is the path to stability? What is the path to an enduring peace? And that is still very, very up in the air. Not because of anything that Ukraine or America are saying or doing. There is another party involved here called Russia. And while Russia has sort of occasionally genuflected towards the idea of peace, the reality is that Russian bombardments are continuing. Russian rhetoric has not really pulled back from its initial aims, which is to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. And it's really Russia which is the block to any lasting peace and the possibility of minerals deals and so on. So Ukraine and America can debate and write things as long as they like. Until we get Russia to be serious about peace, all this is very, very, fanciful, really.
Right. I think that's a great point, Peter. Trump tends to want to look backward and view this deal as something in terms of payment for the past, whereas the Ukrainians want to look at it as the future and towards, a way to have economic partnership and then security guarantees as part of that. So it's springtime here in Washington. Let's hope we can look forward. So to tell us a little bit about now your role at Johns Hopkins University and how did you end up here?
Sure. I mean, well, as you can tell, I'm British, but I was actually born in Ukraine during the bad days of the Soviet Union. My parents were Soviet dissidents. My father was arrested for the heinous crime of reading books and giving them to his friends. This was the 1970s, and my parents emigrated to the UK. But most of my family emigrated here, so I've always had a lot of family here. And spent all my summers here. So it was a very natural thing to say yes when Hopkins offered me to come over. I am literally a child of the Euro-Atlantic space, and I very much hope we have one. It's like, it's a very personal thing for me. But I've been really, my first book, as you noted, was about the growth of the Putin propaganda model. In the early 2000s. That was my first book. My second one looked at how authoritarian regimes were using information war, taking advantage of the digital age. And then my third book was actually about the Second World War and the similarities between Nazi propaganda and Russian and other authoritarian propaganda today. So that's kind of the specialization I've built up. And, Agora is an institute at Johns Hopkins, which focuses on how do we really evolve democracy to deal with modern challenges? How does media transform in order to create cohesive publics that can do all those things that Madison dreamt of, debate and contest, but come to some sort of cohesion. So, the stuff that I'm looking at Hopkins is the stuff that Russia is up to. Also looking to work with local media in America to think about how does America think and talk about its many divides, especially in the context of the 250th anniversary next year. How do we tell an American story at a time when Americans are deeply contesting that? So those are the issues that I look at, but very focused on Russia, very focused on Ukraine. In Ukraine, I've been doing a lot of work documenting war crimes, working with a team of researchers and lawyers to document war crimes, but then also tell stories about them so that people across the world, in America, but also in Latin America, in parts of Europe, are aware of the stakes of the war.
All right, let's unpack the propaganda angle a little bit more. It seems like you've written about it in terms of World War II and then the Putin era in the 2000s. Is it fair to connect those threads even back to the Soviet era to exactly how propaganda is playing out now with the Putin regime?
So in many ways, it's very, very different. I mean, definitely taking a step back, there's very clear similarities between the Soviet and the Nazi propaganda. They're often grouped together in their totalitarian attempts to control the person, to sort of wrap them in a total propaganda that would dictate to them how to behave at home, at work, and so on and so forth. So Putin's propaganda is much less ideological in that sense. It doesn't try to sort of as much to sort of like say you have to be a good communist and nowhere else. There is much more kind of flexibility, but the psychological needs that it plays on, I find, are very, very similar. And my last book is really about that. Yes, the ideology's changed. Yes, the tools have changed, obviously. There are many more tools now. Propaganda is much more segmented now. We have so many media, you'll find a different message to different bits of society. But the underlying psychology is so similar. And it's a psychology that basically says one group of society is superior to another one. It gives people a communal sense of identity where they can victimize others. And it enables a kind of mix of supremacism, sadism, and very, very toxic desires for empire. So in that sense, it's very, very similar. And those psychological motifs repeat over and over again.
Could you break down this period of the last 3 years, the full-scale invasion, the propaganda? Is it any different? Is there anything unique to this phase that's all of a sudden grabbed your attention?
So look, the war has been going since 2014. And Russia also had another war, with Georgia, invading Georgia, also worked with Assad's regime in Syria. So Russians have been conditioned with war propaganda really quite regularly over the 2000s. You could also go back to Chechnya in the late 1990s. So this model of war propaganda where, the sense of being besieged by enemies all around us is sort of pushed up, but also where the enemy is dehumanized to the extent where it's okay to mass murder civilians. That has been sort of like repeated over and over and over. And I've actually just finished a study with University of Georgetown and Chapel Hill in North Carolina, which we'll be publishing very, very soon. I think the abstract is out already in the academic journals, where we looked at what is so similar in these different propagandas, these different war moments. And actually, it's very similar buttons that are being pressed. They're all buttons around a sense of superiority to others, a sense of grievance, which allows you to indulge in lots of heinous and horrific acts. It was very interesting when we gave people in Russia, it's quite hard doing sociology in Russia, but it's still possible. When we basically didn't ask people these questions about kind of toxic supremacist identity, they were more inclined to say Russia should sue for peace. The minute you ask them about these questions, is Russia superior to others? Is Russia a victim and therefore deserves revenge? Those sort of questions. The minute you ask them those sort of questions, after having been primed with those questions, they would then say, no, we need more war, not peace. So there's a direct connection between this very toxic, aggressive model of identity propaganda and the desire and support for the war.
Let's go back to where we started, these current negotiations, and understand the role of propaganda there. I'm definitely a student of history, and I try to go look back to understand what could unfold for us. I've just finished reading a biography called A Man Under Orders. It's about the life of American General William Harrison. Harrison had an amazing life of service in World War II. He became internationally known, though, because he was the lead American negotiator at Panmunjom during the Armistice peace talks in 1952 and 53. So he sat across the North Koreans and the Chinese communists and tried to settle a tenuous cessation of hostilities. And ultimately, they did get to a settlement, but it took 14 months. It's a crazy story, but I did want to read you something from his book and get your reaction. He said, I predicted that the communists would begin to violate their own word before the ink was dry, says Harrison. They did, and they've never ceased trying to break their word. You see, to the communist, there's nothing dishonorable about lying. It serves his ends, and all we know about Marxism since Lenin's revolution in 1917 has taught us the same thing. It's naive for us to expect otherwise. So, do we see and expect that when we go into these negotiations, the Ukrainians are still thinking the same way Harrison thought, but at the same time, you're wanting to try to get to some agreement and then build upon it if you can? Because clearly in Korea, they did build upon the agreement, and we still have a level of cessation of hostilities today.
Yeah, but it's enforced by the presence of American troops and a society that was armed to the teeth and protected de facto by the US. So look, if we get to a North-South Korean scenario in Ukraine, I can't speak for the Ukrainian people. I mean, I was born there, but I'm not a passport holder. But I would think that Ukrainians would treat that sort of arrangement with a lot of interest. I can't say how they would. If there were to be a referendum, I don't know which way it would go. But I think if that was the security guarantee, that would be very serious. But let's be honest. I mean, there's a chance of European troops being there, but it's it's pretty clear there won't be American troops there, and frankly, nobody's asking for that. So
Right.
I think when people talk about the scenarios for what could lead to a durable peace, Israel is much more the example that's used in North-South Korea. So Ukraine that is armed to the teeth, and with a lot of goodwill from America, and maybe with European peacekeepers. But let's be frank, they're always going to be symbolic. These are symbolic acts, yeah? If the Russians really want to attack, they will. The only thing that really will protect Ukraine is the Ukraine that is fully armed and always ready. And I think Ukrainians have made their peace with Israel as a kind of, not a direct model, but a comparable sort of situation. As in, there won't be a moment of total relaxation.
Right.
However, there's another side, which is Russia. How do you restrain Russia? That is really the question. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I spend a lot of my time looking at when the Kremlin decides to go backwards. Yeah, because obviously their bluster is, we will carry on until we destroy Ukraine. That position hasn't changed. But in reality, they do take steps back when they see that their sense of control is under threat. Now, to understand what we mean by that, you've got to understand this current Russian elite, and Putin especially. So Putin, when he was more open and a little bit more democratic, would actually give quite a lot of interviews, which were actually quite honest. So I'm talking about 99, 2000. And he would talk quite openly about his greatest traumas, which is 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. He's a KGB officer in Dresden, and suddenly, the empire is gone. Famously, I think it's his words that, he's calling Moscow and nobody in Moscow is picking up the phone. Meanwhile, sort of East German crowds are ransacking the offices of the KGB and the Stasi. In Moscow, huge change is happening. So this is 89, 91. So that sense that anything can crumble totally at any moment, that if you start to lose control, the center cannot hold and everything spins out of control, that is completely systemic to Putin and his generation. Yeah, they are all people who are in their mid-30s, saw their world crumble. I mean, it's hard to get one's head around it. Maybe some people in Washington are experiencing this right now, but it really is, everything you have known disappears. And that leaves you with a sense that when you lose control, things can spin out of control very fast. And that explains a lot of things in Putin's policymaking. He will push, he's very aggressive, very bellicose, very keen on being, the latest version of Stalin or Peter the Great or these great Russian empire builders. That's how he sees himself. But that is balanced by a huge fear that it could all get out of control. So we see him, retreating quite often. In the Black Sea, when the Ukrainians managed to launch sea drones at the Russian fleet, he moved backwards. He could see that, that was getting too dicey. He couldn't afford a huge defeat, so he retreated. When 1 million Russians fled the country, when mobilization was announced in 22 and 23, he hasn't repeated mobilization since. He pays soldiers up to $30,000 to join the army, which is a huge amount in the Russian provinces. It's the equivalent of getting 150 grand here. He's not lowering interest rates. And the economists in Russia think he's not doing that, actually, because he's very worried that that'll affect pensions and pensioners will protest. He's not scared of pensioners. He's just scared of protests he can't control. So he's constantly calibrating,
right,
constantly recalculating. So the secret to pegging Putin back is to pile on lots of pressure points on him, like a DDoS attack on the kind of decision-making of the Kremlin. So you have to, something Biden never did, sadly. You don't do one thing, and signal, well, we've sanctioned your central bank, you should stop now. That's not the way to do it. You've got to sanction the central bank, announce more support for Ukraine, do NATO exercises in Finland, unmask some of his spy networks that he thought maybe were very, very hidden. Start putting more pressure on Russian society by developing information operations aimed at demoralizing the Russian army, for example. And you've got to do all those things very fast, one after the other. You've got to make the Chinese an offer that will make them less likely to support Russia. But it's all about sequencing. It's not about one thing. There is no magic bullet. But if you can pile those things on, if you can show we have the willpower and the cohesion to pile them on, then he will start to move backwards, and then he will be more serious about peace. Biden never tried it. Biden's approach was very incremental. And there was a lot of hope that Trump would have the kind of, the balls basically to do that, because it does take guts. Whether Trump understands that about Putin, I simply don't know.
Very important points there. One thing we saw that might throw a wild card at Putin is falling oil prices. Trump's tariffs are creating all sorts of market instability, but falling oil prices could be a huge factor if they continue. I know that Russian economists are keeping a very wary eye on them. So that could be part of the many tools that are causing significant pressure. But would that be one of the biggest possible tools? Because that's 30% of their economy almost?
Yeah, oil is the lifeblood. As I say, I don't think there's a magic bullet, but there's definitely a very important bullet in that. Without that bullet, nothing else is too serious at the same time. There's no magic bullet, but there's a bullet without which nothing else will work. And clearly oil is the center of their economy. Look, we've seen this is not just about America. This works when you have problematic situations being pushed at Putin from different directions. The Europeans have finally got serious about sanctioning the so-called shadow fleet. So this is a fleet of rusty oil tankers that basically ships Russian oil through the Baltic Sea and sells it to India and other partners. That has been a lifeline for the Russian oil economy. And the excuse was, well, look, they're sailing in international waters. What are we going to do about it? And finally, the EU started sanctioning them, also doing clever things like flagging the fact that these oil tankers don't have insurance, which means they can't stop in a lot of places. And, there's lots of tools to undermine this kind of essentially vast oil smuggling operation. So the EU got serious about that, and that has pushed oil price. That has affected Putin's ability to export. You're quite right. The fall in oil prices will make Putin think twice. I think that's absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. Also, just America producing more and being more effective producer is going to be potentially a very, very important factor. So yes, there can also be things that we didn't expect that weren't directed at Russia that have sort of a side positive effect on Russian policymaking.
Peter Pomerantsev, tell us more about Putin's psyche. I feel like we might be at this moment of crucible in the relationship between President Trump and Putin. Putin has been, kind of slow walking all of these negotiations and conversations with Trump, not delivering a whole lot. It feels like it might be put up or shut up time, but will Vladimir Putin actually understand that? Will that come to fruition? Are there any other relationships similarly between Putin and other world leaders that could tell us something in that regard?
So look, the Russians are the masters of negotiating while bombing. They don't see, this as a kind of mutually distinct processes. So we know this from Syria, for example, where they would negotiate around ceasefires and then often increase bombardment at the same time. Yeah. So they can be doing those things at the same time, sending different messages, confusing the hell out of people, making a deal, stopping it, starting it. They have their own logic around the war. Yeah. They feel, I think wrongly, that they can keep on pushing hard over summer. Yeah. They also know that they're running out of very specific but very important types of Soviet technology towards the end of this year. So they've got their own calculation about what's happening on the ground, which is they wouldn't mind a pause towards the end of the year. They don't really want one now, so they will keep on playing the Americans and everybody else. And maybe towards the end of the year, they might have their own logic to make a pause, which has got much more to do with the production of a certain type of, chromium lining for howitzers. So it might have nothing to do with Trump. So they have their own logic. So we have to understand that logic and look to disrupt it. In terms of Putin's psychology, look, he's also, treading a fine line. I think he's trying to work out, can he actually normalize relations with America there are things that he wants that would be good for the Russian economy. For example, lifting sanctions off the central bank, which would allow it to sort of like import dollars much easier. Can he have progress on the economic front while at the same time kind of compartmentalizing Ukraine and slow walking it? That I think would be his aim. Let's start normalizing our relationship with America, which would put Europe in a very hard position around sanctions, for example, while sort of stopping and starting in Ukraine, because that's a separate aim. So he'll probably try to do those things separately and keep them separate. And I think it's very important not to let him get away with that.
All right. As we begin to wind down our conversation, I do want to make sure we touch on your investigations into war crimes and what's been happening on that front, your project that was mentioned on that front. Tell us more about that.
So the Reckoning Project is an NGO that I helped found. We bring together lawyers and journalists. There's a team of journalists on the ground in Ukraine collecting evidence of war crimes. They publicize stories across the world. And at the same time, we have a team of lawyers in London building cases. We've been very focused as one of our core issues on the deportation of Ukrainian children. So around, well, nobody knows the numbers. This is part of the tragedy, but thousands of Ukrainian children have been taken by Russia from occupied territories, essentially abducted in a really sort of grotesque Russian effort to kind of take away Ukrainian children and forcibly Russianize them. It's a very old Soviet tactic, actually. You take the children, you break the families, and you indoctrinate the new generation with a new identity. It's something that the Russians are already following in their kind of communist forebears steps. And so we work with a whole bunch of researchers to catalog that, to track the children, and also to tell stories across the world around it and help build cases. It's a very important issue because I think it reveals the scale of Russia's ambitions. It's not just about territory. It's not just about a line, moving the line a few miles. This really is about breaking Ukrainians' right to have an identity, to have a political state, but also to have an identity, to define who they are. And I think you really see that through this sort of crime, especially.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you so much, Peter Pomerantsev. We so appreciate your time today, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation on the next episode of Peace, Power, Ukraine. Have a great day. God bless.